Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the last episode in the current run of the History of Bad Ideas. We will be coming back to this subject. We are not going to run out of bad ideas. But for today, it's an idea we've wanted to talk about in this series for a while. The idea is identity, and I'm speaking to the philosopher Alexander Douglas, who has just published a book called Against Identity: The Wisdom of Escaping the Self. It's a brilliant book, and it's full of really interesting ideas. Alex, we're talking about an idea today which on one level is familiar to everybody, identity. We're also going to be talking about a philosopher, Spinoza, who is, let's just confess this up front, certainly it's true for me anyway, quite difficult, a challenging philosopher, and some of the ideas might be a bit unfamiliar. So we're going to be bridging the ground between a very familiar concept and maybe a way of thinking about it, which is it's a bit of a stretch, but it's worth it. People should stick with this. But before we do that, we should probably just talk through the idea itself. And also, I'm very conscious this is in a series called The History of Bad Ideas. You have written a book called Against Identity. But I don't think you're saying, or I would want to say, that identity is just a bad idea, because it is a completely necessary idea. You can't really be human without being involved in the search for identity. So maybe that's where we should start. What do you mean by identity? You're against it in some sense, but you're also not saying that it's the sort of thing that it was a mistake to come up with in the first place. So what is it that we're talking about here?
I'm using identity in, I think, the most core philosophical sense, which you can go back to the very etymology of the word. It comes from the Latin idem, which just means the same. Unus et idem, we say one and the same. Identity, in the sense I mean, is whatever we think has to remain the same in order for us to remain ourselves. So you're absolutely right. It's, in one sense, a fundamentally necessary idea. Spinoza has this thought that everything, at least every person, strives to persevere in their being, as he puts it. We have this kind of survival instinct, this drive to continue existing. But for that drive to mean anything, we have to have some notion of what it is we want to exist as. There are certain things, certain transformations that we would regard as no longer existing if we were to undergo them. Obvious case is transforming from a living being into a dead being. But even if I woke up tomorrow and, my whole body was different, my memories were different, I didn't recognize any of the people around me, I think you wouldn't say that that was continuing to exist. So identity is fundamental to our sense of survival.
And how close is that notion to the everyday use of identity? Because I think as many of us talk about it, our identity is what we mean by our identity. It also feels it's a bit like the part of ourselves that we think is essential or core, and it has something to do with our sense of self in the world. And I think for most of us, and this was probably true of me before I read your book, it feels like identity is something that is inside and in some ways inner directed, in that when we think about what our identity is, we think about it as something that we determine, like as an individual. My identity is some core part of how I feel about myself, and to identify my identity, I look inside. There are many pop songs which have this variants of this line in them, but you've got to look deep inside yourself to find out who you really are. I think it is fair to say that for most people, the understanding of identity has some element of that. And it is a big part of your argument. Not that that is a mistake, but to think of it in those terms is to miss something absolutely fundamental.
Yes, exactly. Identity is not as it seems, I think, is how I might put the point. Because you're right to say, it's much too simple to say that identity is just a bad idea, in the sense that I notice, other topics in this series of bad ideas are things like genocide.
We haven't quite done genocide, but we've done anti-Semitism, and that's a bad idea. But also we've done in this series things like behaviorism, where the case is being made actually that it is a bad idea. It's an approach to human psychology which has some merits, but the way it's turned into an ism is a bad thing. But we're not talking about identity-ism here. We are talking about identity.
You're right. We are bombarded with this romantic notion that our identity is inborn and just somehow inside us. And it's inside us in this kind of embryonic way. But I think we're confused about identity. We often raise the notion of identity when we say, oh, this person's job has become part of their identity, or their allegiance to this political party has become part of their identity. And sometimes we're criticizing somebody when we're saying that. We're saying, you're taking this too seriously. You shouldn't have made this part of who you are.
And by implication, when we say that, we're saying you've internalized this, right?
You've internalized it. And so we think, well, which is it? Are we born with this identity that's just kind of written into our DNA in some sense, and all we need to do is find it and draw it out somehow? That's certainly a very useful idea from a marketer's point of view. Every other billboard I see in the airport is about finding the true you, which always coincidentally happens to be best achieved by purchasing some product or downloading some app onto your phone, right? But on the other hand, we sort of agree that people have a lot of autonomy. They have a lot of choice about what they choose to internalize and make into their identity and what they don't. So I think that there's more thinking to be done about identity.
And in both of those cases, though they're very different, it's innate, you're born with it, it's part of your nature. Or alternatively, you can see an advertising billboard and decide that you're going to adopt this thing or that thing. But in one case, it's inside coming out. And in the other case, it's outside, but you're internalizing it. But there is another way of thinking about it, and we're going to talk about Spinoza in a minute, but I think we should think about this in broader terms before we get onto the philosophy, the 17th century philosophy. And that is the idea that actually our identity is not something that either comes from within or that we take things from outside and we lock them inside ourselves. It is outer directed in the sense that it is a striving towards something. It's not bringing something in from the outside, but it's looking towards something that is outside ourselves. And for want of a better word, and there are lots of words for this, and one of the words that we'll eventually talk about is connected to this, it's a kind of imitation or mimicry or something. Actually, the irony of our identity, our uniqueness, the thing that makes us us, is that we only ever arrive at it by looking at other people.
Yes, in my book I call this our ontological unoriginality. This is the most confronting idea that I think I've found in Spinoza and other thinkers. We're talking about Spinoza today. This is the thought that we have to have some idea of who we fundamentally are in order, as I say, to pursue survival. And that can't mean just what you already are right now. Otherwise, our drive to survive would be a simple matter of wanting nothing to change whatsoever. But of course, we don't want that. We want to grow and develop in certain ways. We often feel like we haven't yet become what we really are. We're just on the way. So where do we get this idea of this kind of aspirational being, this being that is more us than we are right now? Spinoza's thought is, as I read it at least, it can't come from introspection, because in you introspect, you only see what you are right now. You don't see what you're ultimately meant to be. You don't see your true aspirational being. Moreover, I think when most of us introspect honestly, we find a big mess. There are lots of characteristics that we have, some that we'd like to enhance, some that we'd like to lose, some that we're not sure what to do with. We all fall into lots of different categories. We all have lots of things we can emphasize. Different people place different weight on different features of their life. Some people think that their occupation is enormously important to who they are. Other people don't. Some people think that their religion is very important. Others think that it's not, or their absence of religion. It's just kind of not one of the main things about them. So where do we get the idea of who it is we ultimately are in this aspirational sense? For Spinoza, it can only come from looking at others, at exemplars. We encounter individuals who somehow attract our admiration. They might not be directly in our environment. They might be people we read about. They might even be sort of individuals that we construct and cobble together from different bits and pieces of characters that we've seen around us. But in any case, it's a kind of mimesis. It's a kind of imitation, as you say, that I think drives our thinking about identity, but very unconsciously. not only unconsciously, but I think it's uncomfortable to really think through this idea.
But my identity is borrowed, basically.
Is borrowed. Yeah, the thing that makes you ultimately you is something that you found somewhere else outside of you.
So from that thought, Spinoza goes to some very interesting places, but we've dropped his name into this conversation. I think we need to say a bit more about him himself and the time in which he wrote. So you are talking here about a philosopher from the 17th century, a Dutch philosopher from the 17th century. Just tell us a bit about the man himself, and particularly why, for him, the question of identity might have been a particularly acute one.
In fact, it's quite a hard question to answer, which tells you why I think Spinoza has such a useful perspective on identity. Is he's quite a difficult character to identify. You say he's a Dutch philosopher. Well, of course he is. He's born in Amsterdam. On the other hand, he's born into an immigrant Jewish community who had escaped from the Portuguese equivalent of the Inquisition and living very separately, really, from the rest of the Amsterdam community. On the other hand, of course, it would be wrong to characterize Spinoza as a Jewish philosopher because he's thrown out of the synagogue. He's placed under what's called cherem, kind of excommunicated at a very young age, in his early 20s. And so he ends up in this very liminal space. I think he possibly is the only person living in Western Europe in this time who is not an official member of any confessional affiliation. He's no longer Jewish. He's been thrown out of the synagogue. He's never adopted into any Christian church. The Dutch Republic is unusual. Part of the reason why Jewish refugees escaped there, because it doesn't have an established church. You're not sort of in a church by default. So in an era where religion is enormously important for defining identity, Spinoza seems to somehow escape all of these categories in an interesting way. And so that's one reason why I think the question of identity is important to him. And also, I think because he, from his very early childhood, watched people grappling with questions of identity in a very tormented way. A lot of the Jewish community of Amsterdam had escaped from countries where they hadn't been allowed to practice their religion for many years, sometimes generations. And so sometimes they knew that they were Jewish, but they didn't know what being Jewish meant. There were debates about whether being Jewish was a ethnic category, a question of heritage, or a question of belief and practice. There were all sorts of difficult conversations going on around him that Spinoza would have witnessed that I think informed his thinking about this.
And given there was that uncertainty, what did he have to do to get thrown out? Because you say he was thrown out and put into this unique position, but it also sounds like it was a time in which there was a certain amount of latitude in how you defined your Jewishness. So how far did he have to go in that world to be deemed a heretic? Was it simply asking philosophical questions beyond the point that it was thought acceptable?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question as well. The report of his excommunication mentions his abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. Now, we don't know what his monstrous deeds were, and from what we know about the rest of his life, he doesn't seem to have been, somebody with particularly grotesque appetites or anything like that. But the heresies were given some information, and it seems that Spinoza was regarded as having challenged doctrines that any interpretation of Judaism would have been committed to. The most interesting possible exception is he's accused of having denied the immortality of the soul. But Spinoza, first of all, doesn't seem to have ever denied the immortality. From his earliest writings since he was thrown out, and the earliest surviving writings we have, he seems to endorse a certain version of the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. And secondly, it's not clear how core a piece of Jewish doctrine, the immortality of the soul, is. There's quite a lot of debate on this. It's not like within Christianity where it's a tenet of the faith.
So he's living in the Dutch Republic, perhaps the most tolerant society in Europe. I think one might be able to say that. But in a community where he breached the bounds of its toleration. So he's an outsider. But the Dutch Republic itself, there are Jewish refugees there, but there are all sorts of faiths there. This is post-Reformation Europe, a Europe that's just coming out of terrible wars of religion, in which questions of identity have been central. How you identify is a matter of life and death. But there's also a question which has been quite widely written about, and I think is very interesting in this context, which is about a word that's sometimes related to identity, which is authenticity. What is authentic faith? What would it be to have authentic faith? And authenticity has emerged at this time as one of the key tests of faith because it seems to go beyond something which had, for a long time, been the test of faith, but had been quite widely now understood to be a flawed test of faith, which is sincerity. And these words might sound like they're all the same, right? Identity, authenticity, sincerity, but they are not, crucially. And sincerity was, I mean, this is to put it too crudely, but to have a sincere faith was to have a faith that could be displayed as being sincere. You were someone who clearly was doing what was expected of someone with that faith. You weren't hiding or concealing. You were open in a way. It was a kind of performance. Sincerity is a performance. And there is that line in contemporary politics, if you can fake sincerity, you've got it made. Because sincerity is it's a kind of badge, it's a marker. But by this point, I think people were very acutely aware that if it is a performance, you can fake it in a way. And one of the deep anxieties about hypocrisy in this age was the hypocrite was the person who had mastered the art of performing sincerity. And as I understand it, authenticity was trying to get beyond that and saying this is not actually about the performance of sincere faith. This is about what's on the inside. Authenticity is the inner test, not the outer test. Would it be fair to say that Spinoza was living in the age that was moving from sincerity to authenticity as the test of religious identity?
Yes, I think so. So the literary scholar Lionel Trilling uses these terms, and I think Trilling and others who've kind of borrowed these ideas think about, in very, very broad terms. You can think of these as different sort of regimes of identity. So any society has to have some way of allowing people to define who they are, to demarcate themselves, or at least to be demarcated by others. In some societies, you're not given much choice about this. And a sincerity regime, just as you say, is one in which identity is defined in terms of pre-existing roles. And this is what the medieval centuries in Europe seem to be characterized by. Again, this massive generalization, but the thought is, people are born or in some way qualified, elevated into particular stations in life, roles and stations in life, and your ethical ideal is just to fully inhabit and identify with that role and to play it properly. If you're a member of a religious order, then your role is simply to carry out all the duties associated with that role and to conduct yourself in a manner befitting the role. And of course, a lot of that is still very prevalent in Spinoza's time, but partly because of the breaking up of the Western Christian Church, this splitting off into lots and lots of different confessional affiliations, suddenly there's this new anxiety. Well, there's partly that, and then there's also just social mobility is increasing in this age. People are able to rise from one station to another. Members of the petty bourgeois can begin quite poor, almost at the rank of peasant artisans, and then become enormously wealthy, almost kind of living the lives of aristocrats. And so suddenly there's an anxiety about, well, when you meet somebody occupying a certain role or appearing to occupy a certain role, are you really meeting somebody is the noble person you meet really a noble, or have they bought a title for themselves and they're just merely inhabiting the role? Is a member of some confessional order really a member of the Reformed Church, or are they an undercover Catholic? Spinoza's own community were often referred to as conversos. It was a kind of semi-ironic term because they were technically Jews who had converted to Christianity, but converted to Christianity in places like Spain and Portugal under enormous duress on pain of death. So were they really Christians? Well, of course, many of them were not. But you find this all through the literature of the time. Spinoza was a fan of these kind of picaresque novels, Spanish novels. There's always people dressing up as other people. There's men dressing up as women. There's nobles dressing up as paupers. There's, kings dressing up as laundry ladies. And it's all for comedic purposes. But underneath the comedy, I think, is this profound anxiety.
It's there in Shakespeare too, right? I mean, Shakespeare in theatre there is a lot of role play and interchangeable role play.
Absolutely, yeah. And so what you get And Shakespeare is a great example. What you get from this is this new sense of identity that behind the role, there's the authentic individual. The person may or may not be what they're presenting as. The question is to find out, okay, beyond whatever appearance they're presenting to you, what is the true individual? And Shakespeare, of course, you have these very strong characters. You have characters who are dressing up as other characters, but you know who they really are underneath the whole time.
And I think people who think of Shakespeare's genius, some of it is thought to be that his ability beyond all of that role play to give you a sense of connection with, quote unquote, the person.
Exactly, yeah, that's the magic of Shakespeare, is you can be deceived and know the truth at the same time about who somebody is. And you could say that that's the ideal of authenticity, and I think that's where we get this idea that we started off talking about that is now so prevalent in our culture, of this authentic self, this real self, which is truly who you are. We now take to transcend the sorts of social roles and categories that we hold to now. Proust said something like, classes of the mind have nothing to do with birth, which, if you think about it, is quite a strange statement, because what he's saying is that we're not born. We do have these classes. There are people who just have noble spirits, and there are people who have base spirits, but it's not to do with the actual rank that they're born into in their lives. In a way, he's saying that classes of the mind do have to do with birth. They are inborn. They're just not inborn in the way that we had seen them as being.
And yet, for Spinoza, authenticity is not the solution to this problem. I think it's fair to say, for the reasons you touched on earlier. So just flesh out for us why, for Spinoza, authenticity doesn't solve the problem of sincerity. I wouldn't say it replicates it, but you get a similar dilemma coming out of authenticity because the thing that you're searching for isn't there. I mean, you can't grasp it.
I think that's right. And it comes down again to the sort of borrowed nature of identity, as I think Spinoza sees it. The idea behind authenticity is that you are fully and entirely yourself, which means that you can't be influenced in any way in what you are. You're sort of insulated from external influences. But if identity is fundamentally borrowed, then this is, of course, a myth. People who think that they're being authentic are really just determinedly pursuing some model, some exemplar. They might have entirely lost sight of the fact that they're doing this. It might happen, as I say, unconsciously. But it's the only way that it can happen if Spinoza's philosophical argument about identity goes through. So the strange dynamic that emerges is that a person pursuing authenticity is chasing their own tail. You're pursuing an ideal that's inconsistent with the very logic of the circumstance in which you're pursuing it.
Is it almost, I don't know if this is a paradox, but presumably one of the forces at work here is that if you're living in an authenticity regime, but nonetheless identity is something that you pursue as a kind of mimicry, what you look for to copy are people you think are authentic. As it were, the search for authenticity is outside yourself. And, we do it, right? So we know we live in a world where many of the people who are most appealing to us and whom we may well want to copy or follow are the ones who seem to be very clear about their own identity and to be a sort of free spirit in the world. And they have that kind of glamour magic around them, which is the magic of authenticity. So we are seeking this thing in someone else that we can't find in ourselves, but we think that they have it. And there are two problems with that, one of which is they must also have acquired it from somewhere else. If we look at ourselves, we can think, well, they're human, we're human. But secondly, what we think is authenticity is that they haven't acquired it from someone else. So if we copy them, we put ourselves into a position where, on the one hand, other people will want to copy us, but we don't want to be copied. We want to think that we're authentic. So you quite quickly get into a real tangle, which is you've got all of these people emulating other people's authenticity and at the same time persuading themselves that they are authentic and therefore not to be emulated. And I think it's fair to say in Spinoza, that's not just a tangle, that's a recipe for social conflict and violence.
In addition to all of those complications, you have the added complication, which is once an authenticity regime gets going, in the same way that a sincerity regime polices people's sincere identities, an authenticity regime starts to demand authenticity from the individual, which is, what we see. We put pressure on people to be their true authentic selves, not realizing that that's another paradox. How can they be their true authentic selves in response to the pressure we're putting them under? The whole point of being authentic is that you're supposed to be immune to this kind of social pressure. But that's the situation we somehow seem to have got ourselves into. And Spinoza says, yes, that it's beyond troubling for the individual. It can lead very easily to intense conflicts. So imagine a situation where two individuals are imitating each other. So they've each taken each other as an exemplar. But of course, because each one is taking the other as exemplar, they want to be an exemplar themselves. So they really want to be the exemplar to the other. They don't want to be the imitator. They want to be the imitated. They want to be the influencer, not the influenced. And so you can easily see how this turns into a battle for status and prestige. Spinoza talks about individuals who achieve what he calls vainglory, or get into the condition that he calls vainglory, or empty glory, gloria vana, which just means empty glory. And the reason it's empty is because the individual is attracting admirers for the simple fact of attracting admirers, the sort of famous for being famous phenomenon, I guess is how we would think of it now. But he says these individuals are in fact in a state of intense anxiety because nothing is holding up their sense of self, their sense of self-worth and status, besides the admiration of others, which is not grounded in anything. So all it would take would be for the fickle crowd to turn their attention to someone else, to lose interest, as we know the crowd do, and become interested in someone else. Moreover, the fact that they've attracted this attention to themselves makes them a target for others who are aspiring to the same kind of status. And so we live in this anxiety where we become threats to each other's being, even without violence, not in the obvious sense where somebody threatens my existence by pulling a weapon on me. But if my sense of who I am is entirely bound up with having a certain kind of social recognition and status or glory, anyone who threatens that might as well be threatening my life. And so Spinoza thinks this intensifies our conflicts with each other. They're kind of invested with the sort of fight or flight intensity that we treat violence with.
And that then produces an origin story for the state, doesn't it, in Spinoza, in a way that, what you're describing there, individual to individual, you can imagine an authenticity regime where the only rules are be authentic. I mean, it's a sort of thought experiment, but, these sort of state of nature arguments are always thought experiments. But imagine a world where the rules are be yourself. But we can't be ourselves without finding people to emulate. And I think there is a paradox in this, the way you described it, which is we pick exemplars. So we want to copy these exemplars, but we've picked them because we think there is something distinctive or unique about them. And the paradox is, well, it's not going to work to copy them because by copying them, it's no longer unique. But actually what you want to do is by copying them become unique. But if copying is the way to become unique, then there's something very, very brittle about your uniqueness. And you can imagine in those circumstances it being very fraught, like you say. But then for Spinoza, a way out of this, not morally or ethically, but almost practically, is a sort of collective or social enforcement of authenticity. Is that fair to say? And that's sort of what the state is there to do, to kind of give people an anchor to hold on to. Otherwise, it would just be circling the paradox.
I think so. Yeah, I think that Spinoza has coincidental glimpse into the sorts of things that anthropologists would later talk about when he thinks about the origins of the state, even though these are all pure thought experiments. He starts off with a kind of more traditional social contract theory, but towards the end of his life, he starts suggesting that the state or political institutions come into existence in the first instance as what he calls the power of all, the power of the multitude. And so the question is, how do individuals sort of self-organize into these crowds? Well, through this emulative tendency, as you say. So two people might get into one of these conflicts, these battles over status or prestige. But if I come along and emulate one of them, well, we've now got a sort of 2 against 1 situation, and somebody else comes along and they might emulate the two. And before you know it, you can kind of have a situation where the whole community is unified against a single internal enemy. Once you have that, you have this very threatening authority which rules by fear, which is not a political institution. It's a crowd that can spontaneously form and take against an individual. And so I think at least the French philosopher Alexandre Mathurin thought that this is how Spinoza is ultimately envisaging the emergence of social systems, that norms, political norms, evolve in this way, that the crowd has this dynamic that can unify it against individuals, and the fear of being one of the individuals who's turned against in this way becomes a kind of enforcement mechanism for social norms, which are just things that seem to be majority opinions, that seem to be how the crowd wants to do things.
So that's a 17th century argument. And as you say, it seems to foresee later developments in anthropology. But also, to me, as you describe it there, it makes me think of two 21st century phrases. So one is network effects. So what you just described is that two people join, three people join, four people join, and then the incentive to join the majority gets bigger and bigger every time someone joins, because otherwise you're going to be the outsider in that thing. And so it feels like it's like a snowball effect. It's almost a market of authenticity, but it's what it is specifically is a network effect. The other phrase that it brings to mind is identity politics. So as you talked about it, the ability of the crowd, once it gathers this momentum, the authenticity, which everyone believes is themselves. I'm authentic. Okay, I've joined in with these people, but it's my way of discovering my true self. But what it actually becomes is a kind of collective identity, which enforces itself by identifying the people who are on the wrong side. Is that what we mean by identity politics? Or rather, to put that question a different way, is there a link between what we think we mean by identity politics and what you've just described in Spinoza?
It seems right. There's certain things that people associate with identity politics seem to be referring to that kind of dynamic. Things like, nationalist movements or ethno-nationalist movements or various kinds of political tribalism. And I think you've also pointed out something that's very important. I think one of the most important insights from this analysis is that the crowds have this tendency to demand authenticity and conformity at the same time. It's a very difficult position to put somebody in. I mean, the crowd wants people to align with its way of doing things, with the way that things are supposed to work, the way that things are supposed to be done, but not out of fear and supplication and deference, authentically. They want you to authentically. So, a lot of politics works through this kind of moral pressure where people are sort of said, we want you to believe in these causes and spontaneously, of your own free will, come to do and think the things that we are telling you to do and think.
And by the way, all of the things. It's that thing, we want you to be authentically part of this cause, but we want you to embrace the package. Here's the package.
You have to take the whole package, because if you take only bits and pieces of the package, it doesn't seem like you've authentically invested in the identity that you're being geared towards. I do think it's important to think how many things in politics are played out in terms of identity in this sense. And one of the things that it helps to explain is why things go together when they don't seem to have to go together. Why does drinking a certain type of wine go with holding a certain type of political view? They shouldn't be connected, but of course they become connected into an identity. And yes, I do think that's one thing that people mean when they talk about identity politics. But I do want to be careful about that term, because I think there are lots of ways that the term gets used. I think maybe the earliest usage from the Combahee River Collective seems to be something quite different. This seems to be, originally the term identity politics entered the lexicon. The Combahee River Collective were a group of black lesbians who thought that their material situation, on account of certain characteristics that they had, that they had no choice about, gave them a sort of sense of solidarity and put them in a privileged position as activists, because they had shared concerns and things. So I'm always a little bit wary when somebody, says that they're criticizing identity politics. It's hard to know what exactly to read into it.
I remember thinking about that puzzle of the demand for authenticity going along with consuming the package in relation to the playwright David Mamet, who was a liberal, an American liberal. This happened a while ago. And he had he had a very public conversion. And he sort of more or less announced that his Hollywood liberalism was a kind of brainwashing. And he sort of almost described it in sort of religious emancipation terms. He'd come to his true self and to understand that he was allowed to think for himself outside of, the Hollywood liberal mindset, and that he decided that the stuff he'd taken on board, he'd just taken for granted and he hadn't really thought about it. And I remember reading his account of it in which he said, I used to think that I was pro-Palestine, not pro-Israel, and that I was pro-choice, not pro-life, and that I was convinced that climate change was the biggest threat. And now that I've really thought about it, I'm pro-Israel, not pro-Palestine. I'm pro-life, not pro-choice, and I think climate change is a hoax. And I remember thinking, but those three things have got nothing to do with each other.
Why do they all change together? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really big coincidence that you've taken on board the package. But I remember reading it, and I'd never really thought it through. So your book actually helped me sort of think about these things, which is the puzzle was, but he's framing it in the language of authentic choice, that this is his chosen, or probably chosen is the wrong word, but that he had been in the grip of something which was outer to in, and he was under this social pressure, and he'd liberated himself from that to become his true self. And yet what he seemed to have done is just swapped out one package for another. And that feels like it's a part of that, that inevitable tension. To get back to Spinoza, so on Spinoza's account, this explains the origins of society and the state and political coercion in some ways, that you're going to have this regime which will enforce authenticity to prevent the chaos of everyone emulating everyone else and yet not wanting to be emulated so that they can be authentic. But for Spinoza, it's not a solution, is it? It's sort of what happens, and in a way it's bound to happen because we're human and this is who we are. But we're also trapped by it. And it's not like the violence has been solved by this any more that, than in the Hobbesian account, the violence of the state of nature is sort of solved by the creation of the state. It's just displaced. Is this also like a displacement of violence story?
I think so, yeah. And one of the more disturbing things that Spinoza has to say in his later political philosophy is that there are really only three affects that can bind together a nation. I mean, he thinks that nations have to be affectively, emotionally bound together. There's no sort of Hobbesian story of just self-interest and calculations linking people together. And he says that the affects are love, fear, and hatred for a particular enemy, for a common enemy. Now, love is, of course, nice to have, but doesn't last. Spinoza says, it's very, very, very fickle and fragile. I mean, the kind of love that binds a whole community together. As we know, in times of crisis, a nation might, genuinely experience a kind of outpouring of genuine love for everyone else in the nation. But
in times of crisis, we stand on our doorstep and bang our pots and pans for love for the people who are caring for us in the hospitals, and it doesn't last.
It doesn't last. But, we probably really did feel it, I think. I'm not so cynical as to say that wasn't a genuine affect, but it was just a very fleeting one.
I think it's fair to say some people did it out of a sort of sincerity regime rather than an authenticity regime, because there was quite a lot of social pressure. So actually, maybe that is an authenticity regime, the social pressure.
Well, exactly, yeah, because the social pressure was to really mean it, So sing the song with feeling, and then fear is fickle as well, Spinoza says. So that really leaves only hatred of a common enemy, which is a disturbing thought. But I think Spinoza thinks that he doesn't put it in these terms, but for a nation to come together in a sense of common identity, as soon as something has an identity, it counts as an individual that is, according to his theory, striving to persevere in its being. So if you have a nation that's so fractured or so splintered into different groups that it's not really holding itself together anymore, then there isn't really an individual there. You have to have some kind of common striving. And the common striving is underpinned by an identity, and an identity is defined exclusively. You have to be this thing rather than something else. So I think Spinoza is recognizing there that identity, in response to your question about violence, I think, you can manage the tendency towards internal violence and conflict, but you're effectively projecting it outwards, at least projecting the threat of it outwards. I think that's what Spinoza thinks.
And is there then in Spinoza, maybe it's not a political answer, it's a philosophical answer, but if at the heart of this is that paradox or puzzle, which is that we search for identity by finding what we think are authentic people to emulate, but in the act of emulating them, we're kind of giving the lie to both their authenticity and our authenticity. We're trying to emulate a uniquely self-identifying thing. There's a way out, which is there's something else we could try and emulate. And I'm not sure, you're going to have to tell me what that something else is. So I don't know, is this thing God or is it something else? But as I understand it, the way out of the puzzle or paradox is to find something to identify with, which is not itself defined by its identity.
That's exactly right. The paradox of authenticity is, again, I think it's just a very unwelcome thing. So the alternative is hard to explain, but I think part of the reason it's hard to explain is because it's not very nice to be told that our authentic self is actually borrowed, But I mean, you can see it at the political level, right? I mean, Americans get sort of upset when, there's nothing more unique than the United States of America. It's a great exercise in democracy. And you say, well, why is all the architecture Roman? Why are all the symbols from the Roman Empire? It seems like there's a pretty clear mimetic model here, but okay, people get upset when you bring up things like this. So what do you emulate instead? I think it is God. Spinoza's God. Spinoza, so, I tried to spare giving people more difficult metaphysics than they need, and I think Spinoza did as well, although he's most famous for having this very difficult metaphysics, but I think he needs it because he needs it to explain this ethical point. He sees God as a being that exists in every possible form. So in a sense, Spinoza thinks that we are all God. Not all parts of God, we don't all sum together into one big aggregate, which is God. No, each and every one of us is God. How can that make any sense? Well, you have to give up the idea of things having very distinct identities. You can start by thinking of yourself in this way. We're changing all the time. We inhabit different roles. You look back at how you were in the past and you think, okay, yeah, I'm not really like that anymore, but that was me. So it's possible for one and the same thing to take on lots and lots of different forms. Spinoza's metaphysical notion of God is that God is a being that does this to an infinite degree, to the highest possible degree. And so since Spinoza thinks we can't avoid emulation, some people kind of read these sorts of thoughts and they think, oh, okay, yeah, I got the message. I'll stop imitating. That's it. I'll be authentic. I'll be original. But of course, the whole point is that you can't. But what you can do, Spinoza thinks, to a very limited degree, a very, very limited degree, is start to think of the world in these non-identitarian terms. Start to think of the world as somehow expressions of a single principle or single being that's taking on lots and lots of different forms without ever being exhausted by them. And then start to think of yourself that way. So what you want to look for is the kind of portion of your being that's never fully absorbed into any of the identities you take on. Recognizing that whatever you kind of define yourself as being, there's always a part of you that's more than that. And that part of you connects you to others in this much more intimate way, much more intimate way than sharing a collective identity or sharing nationality or political allegiance or something. We're all alike in that we're all beyond identity to a certain extent.
I want to ask you three things about that. There are many things one could ask about that. It's a big thought. I want to ask you three things to try and just flesh out a bit what some of its implications are. So I'm sure many people hearing that would think it sounds a little bit like Buddhism. And that what you were just describing there, you need to find that part of yourself that is not absorbed in these emulative identities. Is that part of yourself? What would the word be for that part of yourself? Would it be your essential self? But at the same time, it's a thing that sounds like it's a bit transcendent, and there's something which means it connects across not just humanity and nature. I don't know a huge amount about Buddhism, but I would understand why, and probably I have this instinct myself. It sounds a bit Buddhist curious or something like that. Is it? Is this connected to that broad religious tradition, or is it something distinct from that?
I think that it's a thought that you can find in lots of different religious traditions. I think you can find bits and pieces of it, and this might be where it came from for Spinoza in Jewish mysticism, in Sufism, in Christian mysticism as well, especially, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, people talk about kenosis. Kenosis, the traditional Christian notion, is how Jesus's human nature, essence, recedes a little bit in order to accommodate the divinity. But in Eastern Christianity, people talk about this as something that other people can do as well. You can sort of somehow recede a bit from being. So maybe it's there as well. And I'm sure, yes, it exists in lots of Buddhist thinking and Hindu thinking. And in some ways, it's almost a more Hindu idea than a Buddhist idea. Spinoza's idea of God sounds a lot to me like Brahman, at least as some Hindu traditions construe it. But there's a type of Buddhism that I think is different from this, which is the exact opposite message, that there is nothing to us beyond the particular forms that we take, the particular sort of personae we inhabit, at least Chandakirti, at least a certain kind of Buddhist tradition. And so that, I think, is the opposite. There's some Buddhist traditions where what I'm referring to is this kind of undigested portion of your being, this part of your being that resists being defined by any of the identities that we try to impose on it. Some Buddhist traditions say that's not there. That's a complete myth. That's what we need to get away from. I think that if somebody follows that ethos, and if Spinoza is right, that will lead to very dangerous results, because then, there'll be nothing other than trying to inhabit particular personae, trying to sort of maintain our commitment to these sort of curated identities that we've designed. Maybe we're moving into a world that is starting to look that way, but I don't find it a reassuring thought. I find it terrifying.
And would that partly explain why in the world that we may be moving that way, that form of Buddhism is quite fashionable or appealing? That there actually is a relationship there.
Very possibly. There's two scholars of Taoism, Hans-Georg Müller and Paul D'Ambrosio, have a book called You and Your Profile, where they say that once we get past the authenticity regime, there's a new kind of identity regime, which is what they call profilicity, where instead of the authentic self, we have profiles. And profiles there's no real demand for them to be authentic. They just have to be sort of very carefully cultivated and curated, So obviously, can think of this in terms of social media, although they think it's a phenomenon that goes beyond that. That kind of idea, I think, does sit nicely with this particular interpretation of Buddhism. So yeah, maybe that's why these kinds of thoughts are enticing to Silicon Valley types, as well as, Stoicism and these other sort of trends.
The second question I want to ask you, and this may be completely off base, but I found myself thinking about Spinoza. One of the words he uses, beatitude, but also that sense that to escape from being trapped in this cycle of emulation and desire for authenticity, which feels like it is a trap in many ways, you need to find a way of putting your drive for authenticity, your identity, sort of in the hands of something that doesn't have an identity. And it just made me think of, I think it's step 2 of the 12-step program. I can't remember which step it is, but where you are meant to give yourself up to a higher power. And I do understand that as being in part to escape the trap or the cycle of searching for identity. I know the 12-step regime is about escaping addiction, but I think there's thought to be some connection between something insatiable. There's something insatiable going on, and it feels a bit like there might be something insatiable about the authenticity regime. There might be something insatiable about the idea of identity under those conditions. And the way out at a much more practical level in the 12-step program is just to sort of give yourself up in a way to a higher power. Am I wrong to see a connection there at all?
No, I don't think you're wrong at all. And I don't know so much about the 12-step program, really, but I do know a little bit about addiction. And I think that sometimes the problem for recovering addicts is the very intention to escape the addiction. It becomes a source of anxiety unto itself, and then all you can think about is how much you're falling short of this aspirational version of yourself, this non-addicted version of yourself, and you don't reach it. So I think maybe that's there because there's an acknowledgement that some degree of surrender is necessary, that these are clearly not the kinds of things that you can just escape by some exercise of willpower. And I think it's very much the same with Spinoza. often when I talk about these kinds of ideas, people say, isn't it self-contradictory for Spinoza to tell you to try to be beatified when his message is that you shouldn't really be trying to be anything? And that's a perfectly legitimate objection. And the answer to it is exactly what you've said. This is not a goal that you pursue doggedly in the same way that you pursue an identity. This is something that you achieve through a kind of act of surrender. Now, a higher power, yes, in one sense. I mean, the wonderful thing about Spinoza's God is that Spinoza's God is immanent in the world. It's everywhere that you want it to be. But it's not restricted to any particular thing. It's not idolatry in the sense that, I think, okay, well, God is this expensive house that I want to buy. Well, yes, but God is not only the expensive house that I want to buy. So I'm not just going to kind of completely. But what you actually recognize is the full range of influences that are around you all the time. That's what liberates you from ever being committed to a single identity. Is if you truly accept this thought, I think what you do is always look for the voices that you aren't hearing. So you're drawn into a particular crowd, a particular way of thinking. You're led by a particular admirable exemplar. And then you stop to remember all the other things that are around you, all the other potential exemplars you could have had. And the more you kind of live in awareness of that multiplicity, the more you sort of escape identity by surrendering to that rather than by pursuing, intentionally pursuing some goal.
Finally, in the book, you write very movingly, I hope you're okay talking about this, you write very movingly about your father's dementia. And I think a lot of people have experience of this. Many people, maybe most people now. And one of the challenges of dementia is the sense that the person who has the disease is losing their identity. And that's one of the ways that we think about it. This person's identity is fracturing and disappearing. And I don't mean in any sense to diminish the distress of that, because for the person themselves, this is also clearly part of what's going on, sort of flashes of identity that then disappear and vanish. But you write about an extraordinary thing that someone said to you, which was, I mean, I hope I'm not misdescribing it by paraphrasing it, in a way not to fight against this, rather than, as I think many of us do when faced with someone who seems to be losing their identity, think that the fight is to hold on to that person's identity, to help that person hold on to their identity. And we're joined in this struggle against the disease in the name of holding on to the identity. The alternative strategy is to join that person in letting go of identity. And it's a very hard thought. It's a sort of hard thing to think about, actually. But it's also a remarkable thought that there may be some coincidence between what we've just been talking about and a way of thinking about what happens to many people towards the end of their lives. Just as very small children, in some ways, they have a sense of identity, but I think on this account, they really don't. There's a lot of emulation going on, but they haven't yet realized this is in pursuit of authenticity. Towards the end of most of our lives, maybe increasingly it'll be the case that, and this is something, there may be a way, without downplaying all of the distress for all parties, there may be some way of, I don't know what the word is, embracing it, accommodating it, giving oneself up to it.
Yeah. There's a line from the Trancer that says something like, being lodged securely in the boundless, finding your sense of security in the transformation instead of by somehow insulating yourself from the transformation. Yeah, I wrote about that because I think my experience of grief was philosophically informative for me. Extremely painful, but surprised me because I expected grief to feel sad. That makes sense. But I didn't really realize that it was quite as terrifying as it is. And I realized that what's terrifying is that when you lose something so central to your life, you feel like you're losing yourself. It feels like a kind of miniature death because, my father, present in my earliest memories, the very idea of kind of not having this personality in my life, or at least in the state when he was going through the Alzheimer's, not having him there in the same way was something I couldn't really accept initially. I just, I couldn't see myself continuing to exist in this completely different situation without this sort of central fixture. But then I observed what was happening to my father, and I feel like I could see him sort of finding the courage to accept it somehow. And the line that you're referring to is, a friend of mine said, I think he'd read it in a book about, he was also going through a similar thing, and he said he'd read that you have to stop trying to bring the person back into your world and learn to just enter theirs, which is, of course, an immense act of surrender. How do you enter the world of somebody whose consciousness is kind of dissolving? But I thought, yeah, maybe this is a kind of practical illustration. But it's to illustrate a more general point, which is that the biggest problem with identity, despite all the things we've talked about today with violence and rivalry, the biggest problem with it is that it makes it impossible to adapt, because whatever exemplary identity we've found for ourselves, the exemplar is in the past. Maybe the immediate past, maybe the distant past, but it's something that existed in a world that isn't like the world that we're heading into now. And if we get too attached to this fixed identity, change feels like a threat to our very survival, and there's nothing we can do about it. But if we can, as you say, learn to kind of find our real identity in the transformation of things, the instability, the indefiniteness of the world around us, then maybe we can learn to adapt and cope.
There is a lot more to say about the idea of identity. There are lots more interesting ideas in Alexander Douglas's book. So there is a part 2 of this conversation that will be available on Saturday. And if you would like to get it, all you need to do is subscribe to PPF Plus. Click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. In part 2, we talk about another philosopher, René Girard, who has been enormously influential in Silicon Valley and is extremely interesting making sense of what's going on in Silicon Valley. We talk about Girard, we talk about identity politics, we talk about the marketization of identity. Here's a clip.
There's a sense in which all politics is identity politics, insofar as people need to hold certain beliefs about how the world is in order to sustain their sense of who they are. And the trouble with this is that inevitably some of those beliefs are going to be wrong, or at least are going to be questionable, or are going to be incompatible with what other people want to believe and think about the world. And H.L. Mencken said it's impossible to get someone to believe something when his salary depends on not believing it. We'll try getting someone to believe something when their identity depends upon not believing it. This kind of otherwise very incomprehensible behaviors that people have, intelligent people who fall into these kind of cult-like movements or online tribes or whatever and are just impervious to any countervailing evidence against some belief that, doesn't even seem really to affect their lives one way or the other. Why does this happen? Well, because, again, your sense of identity is attached to your survival instinct. Your survival instinct is an urge to survive as whatever it is you think you essentially are. So once you've started at some level, as you say, you might not even, there might be a conscious level at which you don't feel so committed to this, but at some deep instinctual level, your survival instinct has got attached to a particular identity, which only makes sense if the world is a particular way. Not only does that prevent us from believing things that threaten whatever narrative is supporting our sense of identity, it stops us from changing things where you might think that there are benefits to doing so.
To get that and all of our bonus episodes, if you want to see what's available, they're there on our website, ppfideas.com. Sign up to PPF Plus. It's £5 a month, £50 for the year, bonus episodes, ad-free listening, and you support our podcast. Next time in our regular slot, we are resuming politics on trial. We've got lots of really interesting trials coming up. Louis XVI, Aaron Burr, John Brown, the trial that precipitated the American Civil War. But we're starting with a trial that may not be that familiar. Trust me, it's an absolute blockbuster. The impeachment of Warren Hastings. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.